years now. So it's a very different mix of the economy. I tried to find graphs, but couldn't. Than the German economy, which has been this very industrial economy. So not only do sectors differ between countries, and specializations, but this relative weight of something like trade versus industry or finance. London is all finance. That's what makes it run. British economy seems much bigger than it would if you just looked at British industry because of London as a finance and commercial center and everything else except industrial goods. Occupations, to wrap this up, because I got to keep moving. Okay, output is not the same as occupations. Occupations are the jobs in the division of labor, the detailed division of labor, that goes into any good or any final product, This can also be true of services. So whereas social division of labor, we generally mean different, steel industry versus construction industry. The detailed division of labor, we mean all the jobs that go into constructing a house. Now, as we've talked about many times, especially when we talk about production systems, labor going into any good or service is usually complex. Now, that's not true when you go and get a haircut. It's pretty simple. It's one person, cut your hair, unless you go to a really fancy salon. So that's a fairly straightforward, old-fashioned craft industry, craft sector, with many little shops. But most production of an automobile or a table or your shirts involves much more complicated divisions of labor, what we have called production systems. That is, most people in their jobs make nothing. Very few jobs actually see a product go by their nose. You've got to really be on an assembly line or someplace to actually see the final product go by. Most of us, especially you all, will do white-collar office-type work. You might design a product. You might manage the product system. You might market a product. You might do IT for a company. You'll probably never see the final product. I hope you're finished eating soon. I don't like eating in my classes, thanks. And then, of course, this gets tricky because if you start outsourcing or subcontracting parts of a production system, they sort of become intermediate products, right? So say I outsource tires for my assembled car, that's a different industry. It becomes a whole separate industry called the tire industry. But what if I outsource the design of the car, which, by the way, is done? Is that a separate industry? Well, it could be. It could be, yeah. But it doesn't take a finished form except maybe a blueprint. Is that a service or a good? Very good question. And the way I like to talk about this is basic labor versus non-basic, where basic labor is you're actually producing the car. You're on the assembly line. But behind you are all these indirect workers, who I'm going to divide mostly into managerial or auxiliary labor. And those are often fall along the line of blue-collar, white-collar labor, skilled, unskilled, right? If I design the car, I'm skilled. I'm in an office. I'm educated. If I'm building the car, I'm blue-collar, high school education, manual labor, and so on. A lot of it falls exactly along that line. However, that's not quite true because the janitors who come and clean up the office are blue-collar labor, but they're auxiliary too. They keep the office. If they didn't clean up, the office becomes such a mess, nobody can get their work done, right? And they will be subcontracted from a janitorial service. So is that a good or a service? Yeah. No. Occupations are all just part of producing a good or service. And it's only when you break a chunk of them off and sell it separately that it might become a separate sector. Now, that might be producing a good, an intermediate good, or an intermediate service. But otherwise, it's just labor. It's not a service. It's just labor. If I'm working for the auto company in their headquarters in Detroit and I'm designing cars, I'm just an employee of the auto company. I'm not producing a service. I'm not producing anything. I'm doing part of the work that goes into producing a car. Okay? I know it's a little hard to get our head around it because we never do get our head around this. Nobody ever talks about this. So that's why I'm boring you for a whole lecture with it, because I think you want to have some idea about it in your head. And again, the detailed division of labor can be quite different. That there are people who do design work in big cities like LA or New York for everything from fashion to cars to cell phones and so on, who tend to be concentrated in these big cities. And you'll get this talk of a creative class building cities, which I'm going to come back to. Whereas a lot of steel cities or auto cities or tire cities in the Midwest, or button cities in China or belt buckle cities in China, that's all they do. They got a lot of manual labor that makes belt buckles or fasteners, buttons and fasteners in one complex that we've talked about long ago. I forget the name of the town, but it's all blue-collar work. Nobody, who's designing the button? Well, maybe the little manager of the small company, or maybe one sort of more skilled worker within the workshop actually lays out the design of the buckles. But it isn't being designed in Shanghai to go to this little town. But there are products where it is done in Shanghai or it is done in LA, and you get a geographic division of labor, which makes things even more confusing. Okay, so now we're going to talk about managerial and auxiliary labor. This is much more straightforward. I think this is not so. Once we got the basic idea about goods and services and labor inputs straight, we can move to this. So managerial labor is a really important category. And if I had another lecture to give, I would talk about corporations and business organization, where management is like the key to the whole thing. How do you organize your big corporation? How do you allocate capital to your different divisions? How do you own factories and divvy up your factories and the managers of the factory? It's very complicated. But what you end up is a lot of people working in that domain in a modern economy who are managing the big companies that do the stuff that ends up producing the goods. Now, there are also small companies that have managers. There are also people, like in logistics, who manage flows of goods between companies, as we've seen. We call that logistics. So we're going to start with managers, who can be executives, the top guys, the capitalists, and then you get supervisors, who are usually unit bosses. And in office space, that's kind of all boiled down to the one guy. Although remember, there were consultants, so they're going to come in here. You get technical people within management. There are technical sides of management, like accounting, legal, marketing, IT, who help the whole management of the office or the factory or the company go. And then there's an awful lot of other workers who are just necessary hand labor, mental labor to get the job done that the managers want done, whether it's low-level IT work or low-level mailroom work, the Miltons. Well, Milton didn't actually do anything in the movie, so you need people to carry out your sort of ordinary tasks, and people to carry out your specialized skill tasks, and then the supervisors to boss the workers, and then the top guys who make the decisions. And you get these kind of organizational charts, pretty classic example that I pulled off the web. Nothing particularly amazing or original that you don't know about that in this. I just threw it up there for the hell of it. Just to show you there's a division of labor within management. Management is so big today, it has its own division of labor. Now, What's business services? Well, business services is exactly the same thing we had when we talked about outsourcing or subcontracting. It's the make or buy decision. Do I buy it from somebody else, or do I do it myself? Do I have employees to do my accounting, or do I hire an accounting firm to come in and do my books? Do I do my own? Well, this can go all the way down to janitorial services to keep your office building clean. Do I hire people, or do I put it out? If I put it out, if I do it inside, we call it management. If I put it outside, we call it business services. But it's actually still management. And that's the idea I want you to get. That somehow when it's done outside, it's not something else. Right, okay. And business services is one of our biggest, most thriving sectors in recent years. You can see on this chart, employment growth. Well, this has finance and business services, so that's cheating a little. But it's really grown lickety split in all studies. It's business services and health are actually your two fastest growing, what are called service sectors. So business services is by and large a service. That is, it is a labor input into management. Generally, it takes a labor form. Rarely does it take a separate product form. But it can, so it gets a little fuzzy here. But I'm giving it the benefit of the doubt and calling it a service. So, and there are some huge companies do this. The three biggest ones are accounting, consulting, and IT, and there are big companies that do this stuff. You can bring in Deloitte & Touche to do your accounting, your bookkeeping. You can bring in consultants like McKinsey and Bain. Sound familiar? Yeah, we have a lot of administrators in this campus, but somehow they can't actually administer, so they had to get paid Bain $6 million to tell them what to do. And you'd think that over the years they might have done that, being smart people, and instead they didn't. I think he's Z'd out back there in the corner. Can somebody tap him on the shoulder? Ooh. Hi. I know it's dead in here, in more ways than one. And then there's the IT stuff. That's really big now. And IBM is huge. IBM doesn't do any hardware anymore. They just do consulting, basically. They help you organize your business and the whole IT system. Oracle does sell you products. I guess IBM does too. Sell you software products along with a lot of advice. And Oracle's gone into this in a big way now. And so on. There's a lot of companies. HP, the old new CEO, wanted to take them in the IBM direction and get them out of hardware. But then they just threw him out, and HP is a mess. They don't know what they want to be. But now McKinsey and Bain, Bain actually delivered a report. There was a deliverable, as they say in management talk. You get a big report. So that's kind of good. But they talk to a lot of managers, give them advice. They do that all. So the report's only part of what they actually do in terms of their final product. So I'm willing to still call it a service. Although there's a lot of lawyers. You will actually not, if you hire a legal firm to handle a case for you, you actually don't talk to them much. They just do the case. And the outcome is either a victory or a loss. And maybe they'll advise you, and mostly they just do their job. So I don't know. I guess that's a service. Offices. Well, because of management, we have the most important kind of offices are management offices. Now, there are other kind of offices I'll get back to. But the most spectacular ones are skyscrapers. But now we have more and more office campuses. I'll show you pictures of those too. Specialized buildings where you pile up managers and run companies and do all this white-collar management stuff, business service and management stuff. Okay? Offices didn't even emerge from factories. Remember, the factories only invented in the early 19th century, basically, late 18th. The modern office, the first modern office, detached from a factory is around 1900. We think this must have always been true, but it wasn't. Merchants didn't have separate offices. They had buildings where the goods were going through and they had their offices in the building. And you can see these old buildings in places like Boston and Philadelphia, even in San Francisco. By the 1950s, of course, you've got these, even by the 20s, you've got these gigantic office buildings in skyscrapers that are piled into big cities. And most of them are those kind of skyscrapers in downtowns, though not always. And in the suburbs, you get sort of the campus version of offices. A friend of my colleague here, Louise Mozingo, just put out this wonderful book on the suburbanization of corporate offices called, what's the title? American, Pastoral Capitalism. Thank you. Very good. Yes, question? No, that's it. Pastoral capitalism, that's it. Now, what we see is that clusters of these kind of offices, whether they're high-rise, central city, low-rise campuses, are management and business services. And even today, if you go to downtown San Francisco, most of the headquarters, the very top management of non-financial corporations have left. They're out in the burbs. But the business services, that is, the accountants and the lawyers, and I might add the financiers, are all still packing into downtown San Francisco. Because, why? Because the same logic of industrial districts. They need face-to-face access, they need a labor pool, they share certain kinds of infrastructure in the buildings themselves, well-wired buildings, and so on. But the face-to-face contact, which was first noted as a category in geography and economic geography in the 1950s study of New York called Anatomy of a Metropolis, where they were studying especially why New York had so many offices. Now, there are consumer business services, small lawyers, tax preparers, real estate people. You see that all over the burbs in low-rise offices. And those also cluster, right? They cluster in strips. They cluster in little mini-malls and sometimes in bigger office clusters in places like Walnut Creek. And they're like all retail because they need to get the homeowners, the residences that need to be near residential areas. So they're much more dispersed than these big managers that can clump up in big clusters like New York. And the concentration, I didn't put this on the slide, but the concentration of management and finance, well, that's for later, but business services is overwhelmingly in the biggest cities. So cities like Detroit that have been emptied out, and Buffalo, Toledo, that have almost no downtowns left, they don't have much business services. They had maybe 2 or 3 big industrial corporation headquarters, but those companies have either collapsed or they've moved out. Oakland's a bit like that. Oakland did not have a lot of this. It had a few big companies, a lot of retailing. The shoppers stopped coming downtown. The big companies, a lot of them dried up, so there was only Clorox. And Oakland's always had a much more troubled, spotty downtown than San Francisco, which just has all these skyscrapers. And most of those are doing business services. I've had students go around looking at the nameplates, trying to figure out what they do. And that's what they do. They do finance or business services. That's it. Now, recently we've gotten offshoring of office work, of business services. And remember that study those guys were talking about, some services could be offshored. And indeed they are. And indeed, some countries like India specialize not so much in manufacture for export like China, or Japan or Taiwan, but in services for banks and medical, for hospitals, where it's actually labor, parts of the division of labor within a hospital, like Kaiser, offshores its medical records. I think they stopped doing that because they got a kind of black eye for that, about whether they were really protecting privacy of medical records enough. And there are these big companies in India that sell you these business services. That's what they do. Although ironically, given changing, as the dollar has fallen and the rupee has gone up, some of these, Wipro, for example, has set up an office in Atlanta because it's cheaper to do business in Atlanta, in the American South, than in Bangalore, or wherever Wipro is. I don't know where they are. I'm not sure which city they're in India. That was just kind of amusing turnabout. Okay, auxiliary labor, what is that? Auxiliary labor is these kind of things that aren't management, but are part of the technology and the labor, the necessary labor of producing products or services. Again, most of this is for products. So types of auxiliary labor would be design, product design, engineering design, support. Like you need people to maintain the machinery and repair the machinery in your factory. They're not directly producing anything. They are auxiliary within the factory. Huh? Yeah, maintenance of machinery, mostly keeping the machinery going. But you could also say cleanup. You can't have metal shavings all over. Somebody's got to sweep it up, or pretty soon work comes to a halt. Or you've got an air circulation system to clean out the toxics in the factory, and somebody's got to maintain that, keep it going. Finishing, packaging, and testing, which are not actually production. We treated them earlier. We treated testing as part of production. Is it production or isn't it? It's kind of auxiliary, actually. You can put it either way. But packaging, when you actually wrap up the good at the end of the day, that's kind of a little different. That's more like shipping. But anyway, marketing and advertising are clearly auxiliary. And then there's a whole category of things with big goods, especially big consumer goods, but also big office machines, where you have repair people who come on site, or you take them your machine and they get it back into working order. Is that a good or a service? I would argue it's putting your good back into working order. If I go get car repair, all they do is get my car going again. They don't serve me. They just give me a working car. Similarly, guys come, if you've got a big Xerox photocopy machine in any office, there are these photocopy guys come out from Canon or Xerox or whatever and constantly do maintenance or come out when something goes wrong. And they're part of the workforce of Xerox or Canon. They're not your workforce. You're buying, but is it a service? Are you really getting anything? No, you're getting a functioning photocopier, which is what you thought you bought in the first place. It's always called service, but all it is post-production labor. It's keeping the machine that's been produced running so that it's still producing copies. Design and engineering, of course, are very big. Design has been very important in modern industry since the Industrial Revolution. And I suppose you could argue before that Stradivarius was doing design on his violins. But Wedgwood, one of the pioneers in the Industrial Revolution, was already doing design on his porcelains. He had people coming up with new designs every year. You thought this was invented by General Motors in the 1920s, changing models, annual model types, but it actually goes back to Wedgwood porcelains. But it became universal by the 1920s. Clothing probably goes back even farther, but changing design of clothing, particularly pre-made, pre-fitted clothing. Because before that, you went to a tailor, or you went to your mother. Right? It was mostly household labor, or it was tailor. But then when you started getting ready to wear as a mass production thing by the 1920s, you had to have people coming up with designs, and you get the whole sector of fashion design. Somebody's got to design your washing machine. Somebody designs those slick-looking ice-minus refrigerators, and so on and so on. And, of course, in high-tech, that's incredibly important. Steve Jobs, the icon of design, except that here's a guy, one of his designers, and he has many designers worked in Apple. It wasn't just Steve. Competitive advantage. Design is a very important way of making your product more appealing. Italy, of course, is still a center of high fashion design. Italy has lost thousands and thousands of jobs in the production of goods and shoes, of clothing and shoes, that used to be pretty close, although they weren't right next door, to the design centers. Milan is where the design was done, and the silks and the shoes and the woolens were done in different towns around northern and central Italy. A lot of that's gone out, although some of it's still there in these very specialized towns. It's not just in China. Okay? But Italy still runs an export surplus in clothing because of their design. And the Chinese producers and the Taiwanese producers that are trying to do knockoffs, who are they copying? Italian designers and French designers. Those are the two biggest clothing designers in the world still, and Paris and Milan dominate, and they have these design clusters. Engineering is similar. Product engineering, process engineering, it's done apart from production. It rarely happens in the factory. They might visit the factory, but it's often done in separate offices. Yes?
So the picture you showed was John Ives, who actually started Apple, I believe, as a consultant, and he's actually a great designer. So how does that complicate kind of like work or design engineering?
Because a lot of this is subcontracted. Yeah. So it's sold as a separate good. Now you could say, is this a service?
Yeah, that's what
yeah, I don't know. I would think if they give you a what do you call a demo model, it's kind of a good, and they give you a blueprint. There you go. But if they're just giving you a bunch of good ideas that then you incorporate, it's much more fungible and intangible and service-like. Again, it's not crucial. Those kind of differences are not crucial once you understand the idea of the division of labor. So that you don't think that retailing is a service, when all retailing is selling goods.